This is Center Stage, putting your firm in the spotlight by highlighting business owners and other industry experts to help take your firm to the next level. Hey everyone, and welcome to Center Stage. I'm your host, John Henson, and this week we are talking about politics, but not in a way that makes people irrationally angry and ruins friendships and all that kind of stuff. We are actually talking about your political aspirations. I know a lot of you lawyers out there have an interest in it. You end up getting into it. And so I wanted to bring on someone who has a lot of experience managing political campaigns so that they can come and share what it's like to get started and what it's like to run a campaign and go for political office. And so we are joined by the founder and principal at Publitics, Matt Krayton. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
Yeah. So before we jump in, tell us a little bit about you and your background and what you do with Publitics.
Sure, absolutely. So, Publitics is a full service political consulting, public affairs, and public relations firm. So we've done work on the very local level on up to the federal level. I like to say never a dull moment. Definitely an interesting mix of things that we do. And we help with all aspects of campaigns. Our team has pretty diverse array of experiences in terms of managing campaigns and then working as a consultant on campaigns, which are, slightly different roles here and there. But yeah, so at this point, we do a lot of media polling, message development, and general strategy consulting. But we've managed a ton of campaigns as well. And usually we're right there on the ground floor, as these things are starting up. So it's definitely an interesting space to be in these days. Absolutely.
So I kind of like to start at the top in these sorts of things and then kind of drill down into specific areas. And so, for people who may not be familiar with the formal process, right? They just they may think, all right, I would like to run for office one day. What does the process even look like for starting a campaign, right? Because I'm sure there's like some sort of paperwork or something that has to be submitted or something. I don't know, but it's got to be more than just someone deciding, hey, I'm going to go run for Congress. And then they just start, making speeches, right? What does it look like?
If only, right?
Yeah.
That'd be the easy way. It's like, I'm running, declare it and put it in the universe. And here we are. So you're absolutely right. So there are, the requirements depend on the jurisdiction. So every jurisdiction has slightly different rules. Different states have different rules for how to run. The basic process generally is, filing some kind of paperwork with the FEC on the federal level or the state, whatever state or jurisdiction you're in, their campaign finance board or enforcement agency. At that point, then there are ballot access requirements that again differ from place to place. So in certain jurisdictions, what you have to do is you have to go out and get a certain number of signatures. Sometimes that's based on the previous number of votes in a particular election, and they have a formula for calculating that. Some jurisdictions have a hybrid of two different things. So one being signatures, and then the other you can kind of buy your way onto the ballot. So just pay a substantial filing fee to get on the ballot. The purpose of all of that is to make sure that the people who are running for office are serious about running for office. So, if it were just, sort of a case of saying, okay, show up to your local, county clerk and sign a piece of paper and then you're on the ballot, that could open the door to quite a bit of, mischief potentially. So they just, most of those requirements are, are you serious? Do you want to do this? And then from there, it's a matter of building out a team, getting an infrastructure together, and fundraising really is the first step actually beyond the paperwork.
Yeah. So, when it comes to, kind of the first campaign that you run, do you have people who, how do you decide, I guess, which office to run for? Is there advantage to maybe starting at the state or local level, or if you really just want to be a state rep, or if you want to try to run for Congress, is there is there a right or wrong way to go about doing that, or does it kind of depend on what your goals and aspirations are?
Yeah, that's a really good question. This is actually a question that we get quite often. Is we'll have people come to us and they say they want to run for one office, and they kind of go through what sort of commitment they're willing to make to it, and you think, well, Congress, that's can be a very expensive endeavor in certain places. Like, for example, we're in the in northern New Jersey. Our main office is up here, and we're smack dab in the middle of the New York media market. Extraordinarily expensive place to run a campaign. Same thing with South Jersey and the Philadelphia media market.
Yeah.
Los Angeles, Miami, so all of those places are extraordinarily expensive. So, sometimes we'll go through that process and say, well, look, like it sounds like you're serious about running for office, making a difference in whatever community or whatever way that you want to make a difference in. Maybe you should try local office, and usually that's a good way for to get the fundamentals of campaigning down. So like campaigns will look a little bit different depending upon what level you're running for. So obviously running for town council in a small town is going to be different than running for Congress or president or U.S. Senate or governor or any of the other state, constitutional offices. But at the end of the day, the fundamentals, like, it kind of just gets you used to the routine of what you have to do, some of the basic steps in between you and then ultimately winning your race. So and part of it is also assessing the political landscape as well. So I will say this: there's nothing wrong with losing your first race. Plenty of successful candidates eventually or at some point in their career will have lost a race, and there are valuable lessons to going through that process. Some of that may be you just ran in a really tough district or tough jurisdiction, and it was the voter registration statistics were just stacked against you and it just wasn't going to happen. But again, that helps kind of flex the muscle a little bit, and you kind of work out those areas that you need to work out. So it really depends on a number of things. Availability of seats too. Like in some cases, do you really want to be running against an incumbent? Does that make sense? Do you like the incumbent, or are you just like trying to run for something? And like, is that the right place to go? It's so those are the considerations, generally speaking. And then kind of looking at the again, the amount of time that you have to dedicate to it. So running a campaign, for like Congress or some statewide races, or even some certain state legislature positions, really that is a full-time job. And the election cycle has gone from being a couple of months, right? So we're talking 5, 6, 7 months to almost like a 1.5 year cycle where you're dedicated to doing that one thing. Whereas town council, still a lot of work, but or city council or wherever you are, right? But it's not as time intensive. So it's balancing sort of career, family, other obligations that you might have. So there are a number of things that we kind of take into account when we're making recommendations on that. And then sometimes people just decide, no, I want to run for whatever office it is because I have a very specific thing that I want to address, and that is the office that will address that. So yeah.
Also, and I want to dig into some of those things a little bit on, but thinking about once you've started a campaign, right? I know that there's potentially debates that you can participate in, different rallies that you can participate in. You got to have some fundraising events. Are those, are there any other kinds of tasks or activities that someone needs to be doing when they are running a campaign? How do you even go about setting some of those things up?
Yeah, I mean, so it's funny, like in some of these campaigns, there's a little bit of a chicken or the egg issue with the fundraising piece, right? Because you need help fundraising, but you also don't have money unless you're self-funding up right. front, which some people do. So, I mean, there is always a benefit to, if you're committed to it, and this is really something that you want to do, that setting aside some money and self-funding, getting some seed funding in there, and doing it that way. That way you can start to bring on a team. Because some of these things, even though we're all kind of like familiar with the political process, you do need help, right? Like it helps to
Mhm.
have someone who's been through it before walk you through exactly what you need to do. So the first step I would say is like developing a really solid fundraising plan. And that's going to be the lifeblood of the rest of your campaign, because if you can't raise money, then you're going to have no way to reach out to voters, right? Other than, physically running around and knocking on doors. But I mean, again, if you're talking about a large city or a county-wide thing, statewide thing, you're never going to be able to knock on the number of doors that you need to knock on in order to win your race or even make a dent at that point. So money is the most important thing, and fundraising, interestingly enough, is also one of the areas that it's a very polarizing thing. So either candidates love it or they absolutely hate it.
Mhm.
If you hate it, you almost need to kind of make it a game, figure out how to, challenge yourself and get yourself, really like lock yourself in a room and dial through your phone book. So, I mean, that's one of the biggest pieces of advice that we give first time candidates is, all right, look through your phone book in your phone. I say phone book, that's like a
Right.
bit of a dated your contacts in your smartphone. And go through, look at the names, and then assign each of those people a dollar value, and then call them and ask. And I think that, one of the most important skills that you're going to gain from that is not being afraid of hearing no quite a bit, because there is going to be quite a bit of no, even if you're asking for a small amount of money, like, hey, we've known each other for a long time, can you throw me $50 for my campaign? People will say, no, not right now, I have other obligations, I can't do it, or
Yeah.
I don't agree with you on this, so I'm not going to give you money, or whatever it is. So hearing no means that you're kind of getting that out of the way, and then that'll get you to a place where you're going to get to yeses. I mean, you're going to get a bunch of no's before you get a yes. You just can't get discouraged with that. So I would say that's like, square one in terms of a campaign, is like looking at that, contacts list, looking at even your like LinkedIn, contacts, and saying like,
Yeah.
well, who do you know on here? Who could I ask for money? It is uncomfortable, honestly. Like I'm not going to lie to you or sugarcoat it. It
Yeah.
it definitely is uncomfortable for some folks. Like just straight up asking for money. It's a different thing than saying like, I will provide you legal services for money, right? That feels different than that. Because you're basically just saying, give me this, and I'm
Yeah.
running for office. So, but I will say that like people do like to be asked as well. Like there are some subset of donors that enjoy being asked, are flattered by it. It's a weird it's a weird thing. So you just kind of have to like learn to love the ups and downs, the roller coaster of fundraising. So I'd say that's square one before you get anything else in place. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to hire a team. You're not going to be able to do polling if you have to do polling, focus groups, things like that. So yeah, that's really square one. And then beyond that, uh, finding your team. So again, depending upon the race, you're probably going to need a campaign manager, like someone that's like dedicated staff on the ground
Mhm.
who will be with you and just manage all of the moving parts, especially for larger campaigns where you have a media shop, you're going to have your polling shop, you're going to have your field team, the people that are going out and organizing canvassers, knocking on doors, the people who are doing phones, volunteer work. So you're going to need someone else, because I mean, the most valuable resource on a campaign is the candidate's time
Yeah.
ultimately. So that's step two, really, is finding a good manager. And what type of person you pick for that role really depends on what you need. So what I've found in a lot of races is the skill that I would prioritize is someone who actually has really good management skills, not necessarily a strategist, but a manager, like someone who can
Mhm.
manage effectively and keep a team moving in the right direction.
Yeah. So a couple of things. So I know, and all of this really depends on the type of, election you're running for and the market that you're in, because like I would think that running for, like mayor of New York City is going to be multiple millions of dollars cost versus running for mayor of a 20,000 person town, maybe I don't probably a few thousand, maybe over 10. I don't know what are kind of the ballpark costs of running for these different kinds of offices, from like that small 20,000 person town to more of just like a generic like US Senate seat?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, like you said, it's a little bit of a sliding scale depending upon where you
Yeah.
are. But, for a town of 20,000 people or 20,000 voters, let's say, you'll need to run a very robust campaign. Anywhere from 75,000 to about $100,000. Now, can you run that campaign on less? Sure, you absolutely can,
Right.
but you have to make some tough decisions about what you're going to do and what you're not going to do. So,
Yeah.
the way that we like to think about these types of races is we work backwards from the ideal setup for you. So it's like, at what budget can we do everything that we should do for this race and then work backwards from there. Now,
Yeah.
does it always work out that way? No, it doesn't. More times than not, like you do have to make those difficult decisions. So like, for example, maybe you decide, what, we're not going to do any polling on this race, or we're not going to do focus groups, or we're going to have to, rely more heavily on volunteers rather than a paid field program. So there are pieces of that, at that level. But I would say from 75 to $100,000 in most like 20,000, 30,000 voter jurisdictions.
Yeah.
I would, that's like, again, a very robust campaign. And that's assuming that it's very competitive as well. So that's the other sort of factor is, certain places don't have a history of where candidates spend a ton of money in campaigns. So like there are towns even smaller than that where you'll see like $100,000,
Wow.
campaign. And it's just because those places have a history of contentious elections. Like every cycle, there's always something happening, and there's always some big interest in that. So they end up spending a lot more in those small places. So if it's not a super competitive election, or your opponent doesn't really have the type of resources that you're going to bring to the table, then maybe it's not as much. But if it's a hyper competitive election, that's what we're looking at on that front. For a House seat, $1 million plus race. Again, can you do it on less? Sure. I mean, there are certain markets where you can do it for quite a bit less, because the media markets really, I mean, really it depends on the television market, right? The DMA that you're in, and which sounds kind of outmoded at this point, but cable and specifically broadcast advertising, right? So advertising on the low channels, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners, and I'm sure you've been inundated at times with like in the fall of a presidential cycle or midterm cycle, ad after ad after ad after ad. Those are extraordinarily expensive in a lot of these media markets. Again, especially like New York, LA, Miami, Philadelphia, like those are just expensive places. But there are other markets that aren't quite as expensive. So, you $750,000, you can run a pretty robust campaign. I mean, I've seen, again, successful campaigns run for less than that even. But again, you try to work backwards from like, what should we do in order to ensure the victory in this particular place. I mean, the other question too, again, in those races is how many people do we have to actually persuade? Like, are we in a district that tilts one way or another? Like, do we have a built-in advantage based on the voter registration numbers in that particular district? So that depends. Senate races, and so those can get quite expensive. So you're talking anywhere from 2 million plus 3 million to like 10, 15, 20 million in some contentious places. I think the Georgia runoffs were extraordinarily expensive. I don't have an exact figure on that, but that was like tens of millions of dollars on those races. And the thing that happens there, well, first of all, that was like the only thing happening in the country at this point, so not every race is going to get to that point. But I mean, again, you look at a Senate race in a place like, let's say, Rhode Island versus California, like those are two completely different. I mean, the size of those, two states, I mean, they couldn't be more different. So I think that's that's sort of the marker is, and it's getting more expensive to run these races every single day, like broadcast TV, cable TV. It's getting more expensive. Direct mail, believe it or not, huge thing still in camp. Actually, very effective method of communication, but postage rates, printing, paper. Like it was tough to get paper at certain points, like during the pandemic, like actual real supply chain issues, because a lot of mills kind of shut down. So there was this knock effect. So so things got a little bit more expensive and have kind of stayed at that level. So politics not immune from inflation. And then the CPMs on digital are getting more expensive too on certain platforms. So it's definitely an interesting thing. But again, the budgets are going to vary from place to place. But I would say those are good markers. And the thing that you want to do again is like work backwards from that. What does a really robust campaign look like? Like what is a campaign that we'll feel good about, and like win or lose at the end of the day, we could say that we did everything that we needed to do here. Like what does that look like, and how much is that going to cost? And then working backwards from that.
Yeah, and all the more reason to ask for money from some people, because not, I know there are a lot of lawyers out there that make good money, probably not really willing to spend millions of dollars to self-fund their own campaign. So another question, and this is something that I see a lot. You'll have a candidate, they'll burst on the scene, they'll get a ton of attention, and then almost inevitable that a story will come out. Someone has dug up something that they tweeted like 12 years ago or something. It's some sort of like controversial, cancelable sort of offense. How do you mitigate or reduce the chances of someone potentially digging up something like that that could wreck your entire campaign?
That's a good question. And I think it's actually something that a lot of candidates or prospective candidates are cognizant of. Like that's sort of one of the biggest fears of running for office, which actually honestly keeps quite a large number of people out of the mix. And it may not even be like something like a tweet, but it might be something a family member did at one point years ago, or thing you personally have absolutely no control over, but you know how things kind of get twisted, and so it's a really tough thing, and does have a suppressing effect on the number of people that are willing to run for office, especially in like even local elections. Like we've been through a couple races where it's like it got so contentious, and like I'm talking like small town stuff here. So like some of these small towns can be more vicious than like the national level, where kids are not getting invited to other kids' birthday parties anymore because parents ended up on either side of whatever local fight was happening, or like the old grocery store snub. You're in the vegetable aisle and you try to wave to a neighbor and they kind of just give you the cold shoulder. So that because of like stuff that was dug up or like some of that. But from a mechanical perspective, like a tactical perspective, one of the things that we like to do right off the bat is number one, and I think attorneys can probably relate to this a little bit, is that you say, well, okay, like tell me the full story, like tell me everything, like any liabilities, any opportunities that we might have here to message around your biography, but like you got to be honest about the liabilities. Like, is there anything that you can think of, like even if it doesn't feel like it was that big a deal to you at the time, just like tell us about it. Now, you and I both know, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners know, like their clients probably don't always say, it's like, but you're in the courtroom, it's like, oh, by the way, I did do that thing, I'm sorry, like, or oh, I forgot to tell you about this other thing. So that does happen from time to time, but what we try to do to mitigate that, so it sort of cuts both ways. So there's a whole discipline within politics called opposition research. So you put together what they call oppo books. That's the terminology that we use. So oppo books on your opposition, where you do all sorts of research. You dig through all the old tweets, all the old Facebook posts, MySpace posts. Go way back in the time machine. You go as far back as you can, any sort of legal records. You go through, court cases, court filing, just a really fine tooth comb. It's a pretty invasive process on the opposition to see if there's anything there that would be considered disqualifying for office. You also do that for your own candidate. I mean, you should, right? That's the thing that you should do. So that turns up some stuff sometimes that the candidate themselves either like genuinely forgot about and just like didn't tell you, or it'll turn up stuff that that maybe didn't seem like a big deal, but like after having done, hundreds of campaigns on our side, like you just see it and you're like, oh, I know where this is going. So you have to address it. So
Yeah.
so once you kind of know, so again, not perfect because stuff will come up during a campaign. Like even if you go through everything with a fine tooth comb, sometimes you miss stuff too, like as a consultant or a campaign manager. So you kind of have to deal with it, to your point. So how do you deal with it? There are a number of different ways. I mean, it really depends on what it is. So it could be something that was taken out of context. I will say, like, there is this really sort of underappreciated skill of making a genuine apology for something.
Mhm.
Like if it's worth it. And sometimes like you don't feel like as a candidate, you don't feel like you should have to. It's like,
Right.
oh, well, I mean it that way. And it having that dialogue, I think goes a long way. Like that
Yeah.
the apology, just saying like, look, like I understand how people would have taken it that way. And really kind of most times trying to avoid the sort of like, I'm sorry you were offended apology. Like, I'm sorry if this offend, like it's your fault for being offended. So I'm sorry
Right.
about that. Not that I like tweeted something super offensive or or did something like ridiculous back in the day. So I think there's a little bit of an apology. There's also a way to kind of inoculate yourself against these sorts of things too, using a little bit of humor. So like this has really been a kind of an interesting thing for both younger and older candidates, right? Because like younger candidates, right, I'm talking like millennials or really even like Gen X on down, we kind of like grew up with the internet in
Yeah.
and like so just thinking that from my own personal experience, right? So like Facebook was just starting to become a thing as I was getting into college, and like I guarantee you that very few college freshmen, sophomores at that time, or high school seniors were thinking, yeah, this is going to be on the internet forever, and one day I'm going to run for office, and maybe this post could cause me some trouble down in. No one thought that way, so it was sort of like
Right.
this digital native thing. We were living there, posting all sorts of crazy stuff, and then you realize years later, oh, shouldn't have done that, right? So that's kind of an interesting thing, and some of that is just like stuff that like in college you would seem like entirely normal or not offensive or not problematic, but like as an adult you're like, well, like doing a keg stand with your shirt off, maybe not the best look for a candidate. So
Right.
I mean that's a reality that you have to deal with, is sort of like all this stuff that's out there, like documenting our lives from the very early age at this point. It'll be interesting to see like how Gen Z, who really like grew up with it, right? Because like I remember dial-up internet, right? Like that horrible sound where someone picks up the phone and you get knocked off, right? Which honestly like was a totally different experience than what kids have today, which is on their phones, they have
Yeah.
the ability to access the internet. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes. But the other thing that you can use is a little bit of humor in diffusing some of these situations to inoculate yourself. So like don't take yourself too seriously. Like if it's something silly and people are trying to make a big deal out of it, then just use a little bit of humor, joke about yourself, be a little self-effacing. There's nothing wrong with that. I think there's this perception in politics that you have to be perceived at all times as completely infallible, this sort of like perfect figure, and if you're not, then you're not worth. But I think people do connect with other human beings, and it is human to error, right? Like it
Yeah.
is actually a human trait there. So a little bit of humor works. There was one example of this, that this is like an extraordinarily extreme, actually a really extreme example of sort of inoculating yourself. But John Hickenlooper, who was the governor of Colorado and now U.S. Senator, he was running for president, and essentially what he did was he published this book. Like it was an autobiography or memoir, but it really was like an oppo file that he took and then published as a book on himself. Like, so it was like all these like weird little stories from his past, like things that people would think might be a little bit offbeat or whatever. And he just like put it out there, and he was like, I am who I am. And
Yeah.
it worked. I mean, it works. I mean, it's so it's just like if you bring it to the table, it's harder for your opponent to take that and be like, oh, you did this horrible thing, when you're
Yeah.
kind of being funny about it. So yeah, I mean that's
Yeah.
That's what I would say. Like those are the two big things. For bigger stuff, you really have to like go situation by situation. I mean,
Right.
there's some like genuinely bad stuff that like you have to consider, even as a consultant, have to consider like, do we want to defend this? And I think, sometimes the answer is no. It's really like indefensible, and you have to make a hard choice at that point.
Yeah. So a couple more questions here before we wrap up. I know we're coming up on a major election year. Obviously, there's different elections going on almost seemingly all the time. When should someone, what's kind of the sweet spot for starting a campaign? Like how many months out before an election?
Yeah, I mean that's another good question. There's no real sweet spot. Like I said, the campaign cycles have really expanded now. So instead of being a 1 year campaign or 6 month campaign, you're looking at like a 2 year runway in
Mhm.
some of these things. So for Congress or even like governor, there have been some examples of people who are running for governor who started 3 years ahead, right? Just kind of poking around and starting to set up infrastructure, starting to flesh out their ideas about what they might want to do or what their message might be. So it really depends on resources and bandwidth. And then there are some campaigns that are much on a much shorter runway, just based on the calendar, the electoral calendar. So, like for example, if there's a retirement in Congress, and all of a sudden there is a seat open, and you have 3 months to run a campaign, then you're just considering it on the fly essentially. So I would say like the more time the better, especially with the fundraising stuff, because like as the campaign heats up toward the end, as you get closer to election day, it just becomes your schedule, your calendar is going to become even more hectic, and it's going to be harder to find that time to do the fundraising. So I would say like if you can start that a few months, like for a local campaign, start
Mhm.
5, 6, 7 months out. And there are also like filing deadlines too that you have to adhere to. So you have to just make sure
Yeah.
that you're like in. So if your filing deadline is in March, for the primary, which then will qualify you for the general election ballot, you definitely want to start in January of that year, or even like late December. Just start thinking about it,
Yeah.
and thinking about like how you're going to raise money. But the more time you give yourself to raise the money, the better off you are, because it takes the pressure off in the final weeks where you're running around, you're doing rallies, you're going to events, you're barely sleeping, or barely have time to eat. So
Yeah.
like you're not going to want to be on the phone, dialing for dollars at that point.
Got it. So then after an election is over, win or lose, uh, what does someone have to do with any leftover funds, or are there typically any leftover funds after an election, or do people typically max out and even kind of go into the red on these sorts of things?
You're touching on a topic that we have a lot of conversations about here at the office. So like our general disposition here is like, if you're in a competitive race, there's almost no excuse for not spending to zero.
Mm, yeah.
Like, why would you leave any dry powder
Mhm.
in the? I mean, you really have to pull out all of the stops to win. So and you never want to. The worst feeling on election day for a candidate and a consultant is sitting there and asking yourself, what could we have, is there something more that we could have done, or like actually knowing exactly what you could have done potentially
Yeah.
to have made a difference. Like there were a couple of elections that we were watching a few years ago where the candidates were separated by 4 votes.
Wow.
So think about that, 4 votes in an entire legislative district. So you're going to sit there in election night and go, what could we have done? 4 votes. Like you can count that. I mean, you can like you can figure out who didn't vote for you. Like almost like you can almost figure out like the people who didn't come out like right off the top of your head. So I think you always want to, in a competitive race, spend to zero. Like there is almost no excuse for not doing that, other than this weird fixation with like keeping money in the bank for whatever reason. But like on election night, if you lose and you still have $1 million in the bank, that's like a real kick yourself kind of situation.
Yeah.
If it's not a competitive race, or like the sort of partisan tilt of a district is heavily in your favor, then you can leave some money in the bank. I mean, there are a lot of reasons to do that. So, the first is that if you're in what would be considered a safe district, is you're typically, both parties do it a little bit differently, but you're typically expected to pay into whatever committee, like campaign committee at large they have. So, like for example, on the congressional side, you would pay into the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, or the Republican version of that, pay in dues. So then that group can help other vulnerable or competitive, or help in other competitive races, whereas yours is not. So there, in that case, like that's how you would keep your that's how you would utilize your campaign funding. The other thing that people do too is, which is interesting, is like you see a lot of retirements and massive sums of money in campaign accounts afterwards, and you just kind of wonder. So, some people spend that down slowly by giving to other candidates or giving to other causes. You're allowed in most places to give that money to charity. I mean, you can't pocket it, right? Like that's
Right.
number one thing. It's like you can't be like, okay, I'm done now, and here's my windfall at the end of it. So a lot of people do use that for charity. If you lose, there are a lot of situations too where people will have run and especially compelling campaigns. So this happens a lot when you have a candidate running against what your base voters would consider like one of the like marquee villains, right, of the other party. And let's say you came close, like really close in an unexpected way in that district, then people are kind of thinking, oh, you should take another shot next time, and they'll continue to fundraise and then announce for the following election cycle. So you can like roll that over in most cases as well. So it kind of just depends on what you want to do afterwards. But I would say, like, again, competitive race, spend to zero. Do not take anything for granted. And one more piece on that too is like early money is always better than late money. It drives us nuts. So, you'll get a call like 3 or 4 weeks before election day. It's like, oh, well, we just got, another $2 million. And what do we do with this? And you're like, TV's booked, right? Like most of the broadcast and cable is booked. CPMs are through the roof on like like for the midterm cycle, pre-roll, mid-roll, CTV, OTT, those were all maxed out. Like it was absolutely nuts. And direct mail. I mean, at that point, people are getting, 10 pieces of direct mail every day to their mailbox. So like, do you spend it? Sure, you absolutely do. You find a way to spend that money, but it's always better if you can get that in a little bit earlier rather than later, because I mean, there is a limit too. Like if you want to send more mail, you can't do that a week out. You have to make sure that you have everything ready to go before that. So, you don't want to be in a position where you have like this huge infusion, like just a few days before the election, and you're like, what are we going to do with this? So in that case, like some people do get caught with money in the bank at that point too, because you just cannot effectively spend it at the end. So I say early money if you can get it, and always emphasize that to your donors. It's like, the earlier it is, the higher leverage we have here. The later it is, the lower leverage we have. But yeah, spend to zero. That's my thing. I think maybe some people would disagree with me on that, but I just don't see a reason to leave anything on the field.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, this has been really great. A ton of great insight. I know I've learned a lot from this. And so before we wrap up here, let people know how they can get in touch with you, how they can learn more about what you guys do.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can check me out on LinkedIn. So that's Matt Krayton, Krayton. That's an odd spelling. So I think I might be the only Matt Krayton on the internet that's spelled that way. So very easy to find. You can also check out Publitics on LinkedIn as well. Those are the sort of two major platforms that we're on at the moment. And feel free to check out our website too. You can always send me an email. Always happy to answer questions and go through things with prospective candidates. I know it can be kind of a daunting task, and there are a lot of questions that people might have that are not easily answered just by Googling. Always happy to answer a question if someone's got it, or point them in the right direction too. So happy to do that. So I would say LinkedIn and check out our website.
Awesome. Fantastic. That's going to wrap it up for us today. If you have not done so yet, please leave a rating and review wherever you are listening to the show. It really does help us out and gets us out in front of more people. That's going to do it. Thanks, Matt, so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. To learn more, go to spotlightbranding.com/centerstage.